Okay. Hello, my name is Katya Ehreman, and I'll be helping Premier Debate with the November-December topic analysis videos. In case you don't already know, the topic that we're going to be using is resolved. Wealthy nations have an obligation to provide development assistance to other nations. I think this resolution is really cool for a couple reasons. First, because it kind of provides a welcome change to that of previous LD resolutions, where it doesn't have the word ought, generally implying a moral obligation, and it specifies wealthy nations as the actor, more similar to policy resolutions using the USFG, which is different than an individual or an institution like public colleges, which have traditionally been the LD resolutions in the past. Another really good part of this resolution is that it has a really diverse style of ground in the topic literature. While most circuit debaters are having to stretch the resolution to accommodate what they want to read in styles that they are accustomed to, I think the core of the topic literature for this resolution specifically allows for a diverse types of arguments that can be read, which is much more accepting and accommodating to all types of circuit debaters. I think another really cool part of this resolution is that it recaps on a lot of the core topic lit from a popular policy topic in the past, which was the 2014-15 Latin American engagement topic, which centered around the development assistance that the U.S. provided to Latin America, specifically Mexico and Cuba. Because of this, I think this resolution provides a lot of ground in a lot of ways that are really good and possible for debaters on this topic. So, this video will be broken up into 3 parts. First will be a different analysis of the different interpretations of the resolution, ways that the different terms of art kind of semantically work together, etc. The second will be looking at affirmative strategies, one that I think are possible to the core topic literature, as well as ones that evade a lot of the common negative grounds to be more strategic for affirmative debaters. The third type of arguments that we're going to be talking about are the popular negative strategies that are responsive to most of the affirmative ground in the topic lit, as well as ones that I think are cool interpretations of the way that the resolution is worded. So, let's get started. I think there's a couple different parts of the resolution that can be broken down to have a lot of different possible meanings. The first part, which I think is really interesting, is the use of a plural wealthy nations. I think this means that affirmative debaters shouldn't be defending just one sort of nation being the actor, i.e., the US doing something to other nations. I think this means that you can take it either 2 ways. Using a group of nations, i.e., the UN, the EU, etc., which have a GDP per capita cap that countries need to have to get admitted, meaning that they would be quote unquote wealthy, or it means that you can kind of look at the wealthy nations as a bare plural, saying that we're going to be looking at a general wealthy nation and what their general obligations would be. I think both of these interpretations are cool and kind of shift the way that the resolution is worded to allow for different types of debate. I think the next part of the resolution is also interesting. What we talked about earlier is that the resolution doesn't say the word ought in it, meaning it's not an assumed moral obligation. But the word obligation means that we can either be looking at political obligations that countries have, i.e., a common argument on this resolution is the moral right to development, which is an international law, or it can be looking at the moral obligations that countries have to get everybody agreed to and at a certain style and level of development. I think both of these interpretations of obligations allow for different types of debate and different sorts of frameworks that affirmatives must be accommodating to. Next part of the resolution is the aspect of provide. Similar to a former last year's policy resolution where QPQ was the popular T definition, I think provide can either be that you're just giving bilateral or unilateral aid, or it's a type of agreement that countries have with each other to do some sort of trade agreement or sort of provide some sort of assistance with a agreement attached to it. I think because of this, there's also conditional and unconditional aid, which is probably the most common interpretations of what development assistance is in the context of provide. I think this kind of lends itself to analyzing what development you're actually providing and how you're providing it in terms of an assistance. I think affirmative debaters must be really cognizant of the way that this resolution is written, because looking at this term of art, looking at the way that provisions work in the context of development and how we assist these other nations are really interesting. And looking at the different types of development assistance, which could be social, political, economic, which I think is one of the more popular ones, etc., are really interesting ways that affirmatives can have a lot of minute and really small plans that negative debaters will have to expect and prepare for. So I think specifying a type of development assistance is a really interesting way that the affirmatives will interpret this resolution. I think the other really interesting part of the resolution is that it says other nations. Again, it's a plural, which means debaters could say that it can't just be to one other nation, but it has to be to a group of other nations, possibly under a certain GDP per capita, ones that are developing. I think it lends itself to a lot of critical interpretations of the word other, which will be probably seen in a lot of common negative arguments, and we'll get to it in a later part of this video. But I think debaters must be really cognizant of the way that they look at other nations and how they actually provide the assistance to make sure that they are careful with the way the resolution is worded, and are careful with the arguments that they are presenting in consistency with it. So I think those are the reasons why the resolution is interestingly written, and I think debaters will have a lot of fun kind of taking one of those interpretations away and running with it and finding a interesting and semantic interpretation of the resolution for an affirmative case. So, with this, a lot of the more popular affirmative strategies will be, as we formerly mentioned, specifying specific wealthy nations, specific other nations, and specific types of development assistance that kind of explode the type of affirmative ground to a lot of minute policy asks. I think because of this, a lot of the core topic literature that it kind of allows itself to look towards are types of development assistance like refugee assistance, economic aid, trade assistance. I think also energy development is a really popular type of topic literature, but I also think it allows for a lot of human rights discussions to occur about how we're developing the kind of social avenue and social atmosphere of a lot of these other quote-unquote nations. Because of this, a lot of the negative ground will be that this is in a form of imperialistic tendencies. It's a capitalist strategy, etc., because it is the idea of a wealthy nation just kind of promoting their own agenda into these third world or developing countries. I think to avoid this, and to avoid a lot of the disadvantages, which are economic backlash, kind of creating a cycle of poverty, an error replication strategy by not actually developing infrastructure and just giving aid, I think there's a lot of cool types of plans and cool types of affirmative strategies that you can do when specifying the type of development assistance. For instance, if you're really hard set on a type of development assistance that is more LARPy or big stick oriented, I think the best form of economic aid that you can provide, and there's actually a large section of the topic literature devoted to this, is an idea of debt repudiation. If economic engagement is really interesting to you, I think this plan is really cool because it means that we're not just going to be giving aid or giving economic engagement to these other countries, but instead we're going to be helping alleviate some of the debt that they have accumulated and or stopping debt from being accumulated in the future, meaning that they can then build their own infrastructure on their own with the economic aid that has already been given to them. I think this is really cool and kind of avoids a lot of the common econ decides that are like, when we give money to these countries, they don't know what to do with it and they just kind of fall back on the debt that they have already gathered. So with this, the debt repudiation app I think is really strategic because it evades a lot of that common negative ground. I think another really popular app, maybe just in my opinion, is kind of looking at forms of education that we can provide that is kind of avoiding the actual teaching and instead just focusing on building educational environments into these other countries. Because in a lot of ways, wealthy nations are wealthy in the context of they have a lot of higher literacy rates, which is the way that we classify developed and underdeveloped nations. So because of this, I think there's a lot of different types of education that we can talk about when providing development assistance. It can literally be building schools and libraries in underdeveloped countries, but I think there's also a lot of types of development assistance. For instance, a lot of development programs kind of ignore a lot of disability or differently abled possibilities in the context of their development aid, which I think is a really interesting educational aspect that the affirmative can look at on this topic, because instead of just providing a teaching lesson and like sending teachers to these other countries, they're literally changing the laws to be more accommodating and more educational for all types of people in these underdeveloped countries. So I think the ableist pedagogy app is really interesting as well as really topical because there's a lot of literature out there about how former development assistance programs have ignored a lot of the needs of differently abled people inside of these other countries. So changing that would be a really interesting way to affirm the resolution while also kind of avoiding the way that the resolution has been imperialist in the past, because we're just reforming former strategies. So I think that's a really cool affirmative interpretation of the resolution. Moreover, I think the resolution also offers us up for a lot of specific form of LARP ground, as well as a lot of really interesting advantage scenarios. One of my favorite LARP grounds on this topic is reshaping the way that refugee assistance is kind of operating between wealthy nations and other nations. I think this kind of capitalizes on the way that provide and assistance is semantically written into the resolution, because instead of just giving aid, which it doesn't specify in the resolution, and instead it's a kind of assistance, we're assisting in the individuals from the other nations getting access to refugees, changing the host country's protocol, etc., which I think is a really interesting way to affirm the resolution while also doing some good and kind of creating a justice for social issues that are really prominent right now in the status quo. Another common AF, though I'm not necessarily sure how much of the topic literature is actually dedicated to it, would be the idea of a lot of energy development that is necessary in a lot of these underdeveloped countries. For instance, Mexico has a really underdeveloped growing industry for renewable energy. And I think that that could be a really cool way that we can affirm the resolution by providing more renewable energy development sectors into their economic markets that could have a lot of spillover to the economy of these countries, as well as helping the environment, having a lot of spillover to climate change, solvency, etc. So I think in terms of big stick impacts and looking at the way that you can LARP heavily on this topic, there's a lot of different types of development assistance that affirmatives can do that kind of expand their ground to a lot of different ways. Of course, most debaters can find a bunch of different types of development assistance, and they can specify other nations being other wealthy nations, so they can say that the US and China should have a trade agreement being realigned, and that can be the development assistance that is going on between the two of them. I also think there's a really interesting North Korea app on this topic, where the development assistance is realigning the trade or the triangular alliance that is happening between the US, North Korea, and Japan, especially with a lot of South Korean tensions growing in the status quo. So I think that in the context of a lot of possible impact scenarios that are happening and that are really prevalent in politics today, there are a lot of really interesting ways for the affirmative to contextualize development assistance, provide, and what the other nation actually is, to affirm in their own style and way. So this kind of brings us to lastly, which is talking about a lot of common negative strategies. I kind of mentioned them before when talking about affirmative strategies to avoid most of these, but I think a lot of the more popular negative strategies will be the imperialism or the CAP-K, which kind of talk about the expansion and the stretch of like hegemony and ideologies from a lot of Western nations, either through like pedagogy or through a form of like imperialist tendencies of hegemony, kind of creating this form of expansionism and spread of their ideas, or through actual like economic or literal engagement with these countries by spreading capitalist tendencies, by trying to engage in other markets, etc., which is a lot of the core of a lot of capitalism and imperialism critique ground. I think those are just really intuitive ways to interpret the critical ground on the negative of this resolution, and I think a lot of debaters will actually kind of follow suit with this interpretation. I think other possible common negative strategies will be like the disadvantages that we talked about earlier, which would be like the economic disadvantage, which can probably be tied to a lot of other sectors of development assistance, which is basically when we just provide aid, we don't actually rebuild the infrastructure in these other countries. They'll never be able to actually sustain the development that we are providing them, and they'll also just like replicate the problems that we have seen already. There's also a lot of issues of providing backlash, because whenever the U.S. has empirically gone into these other countries to provide development, a lot of the natives inside of these regions have not liked these kind of Westerners coming in and promoting their own ideals, and has caused a lot of like anti-Westernism and anti-Western sentiments being grown in a lot of regions of the world, which I think is probably empirically proven. This can be changed if you don't defend the U.S. as the actor or use a different type of multilateral agency, but I think these are a lot of common negative arguments that most debaters will kind of look at. I think there are a lot of actor or agent-specific counterplans that you can do, specifically in the context of a lot of these hyper-specific apps with different countries, but I think that kind of depends on the way that a lot of people interpret the resolution. but I would be looking into different sorts of agencies that involve in these common countries that we're going to be providing development assistance in, i.e., Mexico, Latin America, etc., in ways that we can already use different actors to do the development that we were talking about than these wealthy nations. I think another really common critique that the negatives will get up and read, and I think is actually a really true and popular argument in a lot of critical literature, is the idea of like the borders or the nations critique. Talking about when we otherize these other nations and we look at nations in terms of like their state sovereignty and looking at the borders that control them, it's a form of like biopolitical thought. It's creation of like these cartographies and of these really subjective binaries of borders that aren't really there, but they just delineate state control. And a lot of critical literature talks about why these borders being arbitrarily decided are bad and cause a lot of war and violence and dehumanization, etc. So I think the Borders K will be a really popular and a really interesting negative strategy on this topic that I look forward to seeing in a lot of bid tournaments in the future. I think other negative aspects of the resolution will, of course, be T. There's a lot of really interesting spec shells that people can read, talking about how you must specify or you may not specify a type of other nation, a type of wealthy nation, a type of development assistance, etc. And I think kind of forcing people into the different types of provisions and the different types of assistance would be a really interesting topical interpretation for neg debaters to utilize, to not only evade and shrink the affirmative ground to a more suitable size for negatives to prep out, because it's kind of unreasonable that we prep out every type of other nation, every type of wealthy nation, and every type of development assistance between them. So I think the negative utilizing the topical interpretations of the resolution and writing really interesting and complex T-shells would be a great way to negate almost every round on this topic. So after this, I think after we've kind of gone over a lot of the common affirmative and negative arguments and kind of interpreted the resolution in the most popular ways, I kind of wanted to throw in some of my favorite interpretations of the resolution that I think are a little less popular, a little less intuitively true, but a little bit more cool based off the topic list that I have found. So I think both of these kind of predicate on like what is a nation. I think a really popular, potentially affirmative ground for a lot of pseudo-K debaters in this circuit right now will be that the fact that the nation is defined as like a group of people with a shared culture. It's not necessarily a state or a sovereign entity, which would mean that popularly indigenous tribes and native countries will be other nations that we can use. So this kind of opens up the possibility of more so give back the land type affirmatives, kind of getting into indigenous epistemology and pedagogy, and looking at the way that we can kind of orient ourselves towards rehabilitating and kind of giving reparations to these indigenous tribes after the years of awful things that we have done to them. So I think that interpreting nations, which is literally an interpretation of other nations being indigenous territories in the U.S. Constitution, would be really cool, because that is a way that we can kind of critically affirm the resolution in a different light that is definitely avoiding a lot of common negative interpretations. I think this kind of lends itself to other potentially critical and other really cool interpretations of what a nation is, since it is a group of people with shared cultures and characteristics that allow for a lot of debaters to kind of interpret the resolution as they want to, as different groups of people, that could kind of allow for a lot of different identity politics apps to take fruition. So I think that in terms of different, not necessarily popularized, but cool interpretations of the resolution, which I'm not necessarily sure are going to be seen in a lot of other topic analysis videos, I think that the indigenous AF, as well as different identity politics AFs that specify a type of group of people or a type of shared culture that makes up a nation, would be a really cool way to interpret the way that this resolution is written. So, with this, I think that is the conclusion of this video. Thank you for watching and sticking around with Premier Debate. Look up for us on our January-February Premier Debate topic analysis videos, as well as brief that will be free and coming out in the next couple months. And look at our different videos to see other ways that people interpret the resolution and the common arguments that they find with it.